Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion. My name is Bridget Wilkins, and it is such a pleasure to join you all here today to discuss this very timely topic around the recovery of the square mile, and be joined by such an esteemed panel of guests based in London and beyond right now, working both in the public and the private sector, and on some really exciting projects that hopefully will help us build back better post the COVID recovery. They need no introduction, but I will remind you who's joining us today so that you can think of some questions to ask them later in the Q&A after the wider discussion. To start off, we have Damien Nussbaum, who is the Director of Innovation and Growth at the City of London Corporation, Karen Cook, the founder of PLP Architecture, a CPA board member and the lead architect on 22 Bishopsgate, Alistair Moss, the Chair of the Planning and Transportation Committee from the City of London Corporation and the co-chair of the Recovery Task Force, Gareth Roberts, Head of Broadgate Developments from British Land and a CPA board member, Patrick Wong, Founder and Chief Executive of Tenacity, and myself, who was Director of Community Engagement at Built ID. Whilst today's discussion is undoubtedly going to focus on the future of the square mile and how we can build a more inclusive, a more sustainable, and a more resilient built environment and business economy, I think it's important to remember that this is not the first time London has bounced back. And in fact, we have quite a colourful and unique history of rebuilding and reinventing ourselves, from the foundations of Roman ruins to the ashes of great fires to the destruction of even wars only less than 50, 60 years ago. These events and many more have shaped the city that we see today. We walk down her streets, get lost in her cobblestone alleys, and I can imagine that it's one of the only cities in the world that has as many layers of progressive development that we can all experience in many ways. But with that history comes a responsibility to shape a much more sustainable and inclusive future. And the City of London Corporation have worked really hard on this COVID recovery task force, looking at and defining some key policies and priorities that will help shape this future for the years to come. So with that, I'd like to invite our first presenter, Damien, to take us away and talk in further detail about this recovery and what it means for everyone working and living within the square mile and surrounding boroughs. Thanks, Damien.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Bridget, and great to be with you. So I'm Damien Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Innovation and Growth at the City of London. In a moment, I'll turn to the Recovery Task Force, which we published in April this year. First, I've also been asked just to cover a survey of city firms' return plans that we've just started doing. Next slide, please. So we've started asking the largest city firms for a regular update to track how their return to office plans are evolving. We received responses from 84 city firms in the first iteration in April. It covers about 20% of the city's total workforce of 540,000. So there's around 100,000 responses in terms of the firms that came back to us. Next slide. In April, levels in the office were low, as we would expect in line with government guidance to work from home. But firms expected this to jump in June as government guidance changes. And from there, we saw a healthy increase over the summer and that trend continuing strongly over the autumn. In other words, companies see this as a process, not a one-off event. And no surprises that longer-term hybrid working would grow. Firms expect a threefold increase in working from home at least one day per week. But what's interesting is the pattern of that working from home. And the most popular schedule at the moment in the longer-term future was to work remotely 1 to 2 days a week. Firms have reiterated the importance of the office for new joiners, networking, collaboration and creativity, mental health and well-being. Next slide. And what about how the space in offices is used? As expected, we see increases in communal and collaborative spaces and decreases in desk space. But we're also seeing a lot of wait and see. Many are taking no immediate measures. They're watching the competition and they're waiting to see how their own needs evolve. Next slide. Nearly half of firms surveyed are signposting employees to community testing of one kind or another. And we also had some interesting ideas around marketing packs for workers to encourage their return and reassure them on safety. Firms flagged public transport as the largest concern, both in terms of safety and, unsurprisingly, the pricing element of rail cards, which of course there are now some interesting ideas about how that can work rather differently. And so next slide to the recovery task force. So our starting point for this was in the wake of the pandemic, cities across the world facing a critical challenge. Our conviction was that those cities agile enough to adapt to this new environment and help shape it will thrive. So we believe the City of London Corporation has a strong role to play in supporting the long-term recovery of the square mile and with it supporting the recovery of the capital and the country. But we can only do so if we work closely in partnership. And those partnerships need to be with businesses, with cultural organisations, with local and national government. And they must include workers, visitors, residents. So on to our conclusions. The overall plan looked at 3 dimensions, as you can see here: world-class business ecosystem, vibrant offer, and outstanding environments. And we identified a series of big moves, 6 in all, and those 6 big moves will be delivered through a programme of ambitious actions. So let me take you on a whistle-stop tour of the big moves and the actions as set out in the report. Next slide. The first dimension builds on our world-class business ecosystem. And here we've identified 3 big moves. The first of those is to enable high potential businesses to start, adapt and grow. And in some ways, this surprised some commentators, because for so long they've identified the square mile as being somewhere that has a warm welcome for the bigger firms. But we want to reinforce that the square mile's welcome for smaller, high potential firms is also very strong. And our newly refocused Small Business Research and Enterprise Centre, for example, will provide essential business data and tailored business support to SMEs in the city. Next slide. The second of the big moves is to open London's opportunities to everyone. And in the feedback we had from more than 250 firms that we interviewed for this work, one word came up again and again, and that one word was talent. It's a huge ingredient of what brings firms here and what keeps them here. And that requires a world-class visa system that attracts the highest quality talent into the UK. And we at the corporation will be building on the work we've already done to champion this. But equally, we'll be supporting a nurturing environment for domestic talent, wherever it comes from. And amongst the initiatives we'll be supporting, we'll drive forward our leadership role on socioeconomic diversity to encourage progression of all backgrounds within firms. Next slide. So this is all about curating a thriving innovative ecosystems in strategic sectors. And we see already that we have huge strengths in areas like sustainable finance, tech, creative industries. We had time, it'd be lovely to go into all of those. Just one to touch on in passing, in this year of COP26, the corporation is already working with government, with Mark Carney, to bring together a strong financing presence in Glasgow, so that we're not just talking about commitments and aspirations, but we're actually talking about mobilizing capital for the huge transition that's already underway. And we'll be launching our COP26 plans tomorrow. Perhaps we can send around a link so that those of you who are interested can join that launch tomorrow. Next slide. Moving on from world-class business ecosystem, the second dimension is to create and sustain a vibrant and engaging city offer. In other words, why the square mile is a great place to be for workers, visitors and residents. And as one firm put it to us, we can create a great office environment, but we need to work together for there to be dynamism across the city. So we'll celebrate all the square mile has to offer through a marketing campaign that will be getting underway over the summer, and deliver that campaign together with the sectors that are essential to creating the city's vibrant offer. And alongside that, many of the businesses that make the square mile such a special place to be are small independent retail and hospitality businesses. They need to survive and thrive as their customers return. And our COVID recovery fund of up to 50 million is there to support them. Next slide. The final dimension concerns our outstanding environments. So the fifth area is shaping the future city. And we know that the Square Mile is an attractive location, and the pandemic certainly hasn't changed that. As we see here, the future skyline of the Square Mile will look even more dynamic. And in shaping that future city, we need it to be resilient, we need it to be sustainable. We also need to be connected, so we'll be ensuring that the Square Mile's communications, energy and transport infrastructure are best in class and future-proofed. Next slide. And finally, the sixth big move is around world-class streets and public spaces. We'll need to provide new and improved public spaces that are a real pleasure to spend time in, including more green spaces and opportunities for culture and exercise. Next slide. So to conclude, the city's offer is for workers, visitors and residents. It's for large and small businesses and investors with a great offer around culture, arts and heritage, retail and hospitality. And the threads drawing this together, running through it all, are inclusion, innovation and sustainability. So as ever, implementation will be key, and we want to work in partnership across the Square Mile, London and the UK, with businesses, investors, developers, organisations, with workers, visitors and residents. Next slide. So I hope we'll be able to send around the report and the film that accompanies it, and welcome your feedback and your partnership in implementing what is a really ambitious plan for the Square Mile. And now back to the panel.
Thank you so much, Damien. What an interesting discussion. And I love that last image you had in Smithfield Market. What a brilliant story there. And obviously linking back to some of the initiatives with the Cultural Mile, some very exciting points. Alistair, I'd love to pass on to you for a few minutes to really discuss in further detail some of the key priorities of the recovery plan from your perspective, and welcome your thoughts on some of the key agenda items moving forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Bridget, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, so it's a really exciting bit of work, and you know, Damien kind of touched on some of the numbers of people and organisations we consulted. There were over 4,000 people that responded, people that we've all been excluded from the city in the last year or so. So, you know, kind of obvious real interest about how we come back and how the city should be looking and what the city's offer is, basically. And we see this as a time to reset and refocus, but principally, you know, to be looking at our plans and priorities, where we were going to and how they need to be nuanced and refined, and to open up that discussion as the local authority leaders to see how what people at an individual level as workers and residents and visitors and what businesses are telling us. So I say it's been a hugely empowering process, with high levels of engagement and a lot of kind of granular detail, but some strategic thinking at first. And there's a lot of negatives about the pandemic, but one real positive is that we've all thought about what we do, where we need to do it, and why, and what's best for us. And that's, you know, a generation is a once in a lifetime, if not more. You know, we're never going to have, hopefully, this opportunity again to do this. So we need to make some positive from this. And I think, you know, what we think about the city is, as you alluded to it in your opening remarks, Bridget, is the city has weathered a huge amount over millennia, really, and it is really adaptable as an ecosystem. But it's fundamentally here to serve the people that want to do business within it and visit it and live in it. So this report is about looking at our policies, asking people what they need and want, and refining where we were going to. And a lot of it has been about the kind of reassurance that we had really at the outset. I mean, no one really predicted a pandemic and what effect it would have, but the direction of travel for the city, both in terms of our city plan, making the city more sustainable and more inclusive and more diverse, is there and continues. Making the city's transport network a more sustainable one, encouraging active travel, bringing back the streets to far more kind of people-focused, bluntly less dangerous and far more pleasant to be in, enhancing our planning policies so that we really are quite obsessed about the experience that people have, not being dominated by built environment, but by built environment serving people. And all those things kind of coming together really, and having all the priorities that Damien has listed then, and then hundreds of outcomes from those as to how we'll be tracking the progress. So we're really excited that this has been an empowering process, and we're determined to work really with everyone on this call and everyone who's interested in the city going forward to ensure that we can implement it, and most importantly, that we work with people at an individual and a business and organisational level to ensure that we get that delivery right.
Fantastic. And I'm obviously very biased because I do community engagement. I'm the director of community engagement. So this is a big area of passion of mine. But, you know, the power is with the people, both at an individual and corporation level. And, you know, the attitude of the city to connect with those people, to consult and meaningfully engage and to shape the policy is just so exciting because it builds, you know, inherent resilience in the future because we're all part of shaping that together. So I'm very, very excited for this conversation and sort of the delivery of this action plan as it follows out. I suppose, Alistair, I'd like to open up the panel discussion with another question to you, which is, out of all that, it's quite a loaded question, but, you know, in the backdrop of everything that's changed, everything we hope will change, continue to change and evolve, what do you see as one of the biggest changes, particularly from, you know, the wider built environment that could be possible in the next 3 to 5 years across the square mile?
I think going back to what I was saying before about the fact that we now all kind of have the decision-making processes where we need to be when to be most effective for outputs and for our own health and all that, the city, you know, has got to be more attractive. It's got to provide. So whilst, you know, developers are great, and there's a whole future, I think, of what the office and working environment will look like, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. It is about what those external spaces are and how it kind of meshes together. And as Damien talked about there, it is about making the city bluntly more interesting and more human scale and more diverse. Everyone feeling welcome into it, feeling there are really exciting things to do, both in terms of leisure, food and beverage, the cultural offer, and us kind of showcasing that. So I think a change will be that we need to up our game in terms of attracting that talent in, and having attracted that diverse talent in from as the world opens up across the world, but also within London and the UK. And then as that happens, not really taking anything for granted and really keeping on top of that as to and providing that motivation, if you like, for people to come into town for whatever reason is best for them.
Absolutely. And Karen, from your experience working on the 22 Bishopsgate and a number of projects across the square mile, how are you seeing that that agenda evolve in terms of how the built environment is designed, both on sort of the wider public realm and then moving into sort of more private space, and the blurring of those two spaces evolve together? Yes.
Well, I think the city has some world-class public spaces already. Some of them are new and some are old. And of course, we need many more to achieve the targets that Alistair has clearly outlined. If I can just briefly describe some of the old and new, and then talk about maybe some examples elsewhere we could look at. Aldgate Square, which is near my office, was previously a gyratory that was very dangerous for cyclists and really severed the city from Whitechapel. And we closed, or the city closed the gyratory and created a marvelous new park with cafe and sculpture in the city has a piece there. Office workers meet for lunch and the children from the primary school adjacent can meet their friends there and play. It took 10 years. So hopefully we can figure out a way to speed some of those things up. There are some secret gardens, which are completely different at the other end of the scale. Wren has some amazing churches. Unfortunately, some of them bombed during the war, but they've become some of the secret gardens like Greyfriars Churchyard north of St. Paul's. It's a wonderful place to sort of secret away and contemplate. So I think while we need spaces to meet our friends, we also need places to be able to go away and escape. Maybe you're having a difficult day at the office, or you just need to think about something. There are some new spaces under construction. Of course, Bank Junction, everybody knows about the proposals. Maybe lesser known is the Thames River sewer project, which is building like an archipelago of spaces that project a cantilever out into the river. And there's one at Blackfriars Bridge. And I, for one, would like for the city to be much bolder and think about maybe linking with a walkway all the way along the river. I know they've wanted to do that, but by waiting for private development to take place, it's going to be another century. So it would be potentially interesting to make a walkway all along the river, linking Blackfriars Bridge all the way to Tower. I think it's useful to look at spaces outside of London. Other cities look to us, but I think we could look at other cities as well, maybe for some development tricks. New York City, for example, gives development benefits in exchange for creation of new public space. And I'm thinking example from the 1960s that everybody knows very well, but it's still working. It's Paley Park on East 53rd Street, where a building was demolished. It was a nightclub, and it's still a much needed space. And I think I could envisage the city even buying some smaller obsolete buildings and tearing them down and creating little pocket parks. They've done that in Paris in the 11th, which is a highly dense neighborhood. They tore down some buildings as Jardin Trouillot in the 11th, and they linked two boulevards with a brand new and wonderful garden. Yeah, I think at 22, of course, we have the viewing gallery, and we have created a new permeable route across the site. The viewing gallery is the type of space that the city has created for free to offer to the public to come up into the buildings for free. I think it's terrific. It gives the sense of ownership and appropriation that the buildings are integrated into the city. I'd like to see more of them, like at Fen Court, Eric Perry's building, where the roof terrace is at lower level and it's generous and open and outdoors. I think some of the lower level spaces, maybe people feel that it's quicker and easier to get to. Of course, then you have the amenities that we have at 22, and Stuart Lipton's idea there for the vertical village is that there are spaces outside the office where people can go, and I think some of them will be open to the public, such as the food market in the evening. I think tenants actually want that, occupiers want that, and you need that critical mass of a large tower to be able to pay for some of those things.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. Lots of great examples there, and I'll be sure to be looking some of those up after our panel discussion. It's always interesting, yeah, isn't it? When you I mean, obviously none of us have really traveled that much in the last 12 months, but when you do travel, it's always around, I use it as a good excuse to, inspiration gathering. What can we learn from Paris or vice versa? And that's what it's about. It's about sharing and collaborating ideas, so we can all obviously sustain and retain our built environments and our natural ones as well as part of the parks. Gareth, I might go to you next. Obviously, there's been a big focus recently with Broadgate and the number of developments that are happening sort of intrinsically, but the wider master plan. Italy opened the last few weeks. I'm sure most people have gone there already. If not, it's probably on their agenda. It's very exciting. How are you seeing sort of the wider demand for more accessible public realm, more green space being incorporated into what you're delivering, and how do you see that being valued by some of the occupiers that you've managed to attract to the master plan?
Thanks, Bridget. I'll probably pick up on those 2 points around the public realm and also the amenity. I think to build on something that Karen was just saying around inspirational spaces where you learn from other people, Paley Park is an example that's often used. But then how do you create those things? I think the city's already been pushing us a lot, and they've been enabling those sorts of public realm interventions we use with the development that we just started on site with at 1 Broadgate. We've used Paley Park as an inspiration for turning an unloved space into something that is more special and integrates with the office reception. But I think when we come, I think it's okay to leave the market or the developers to find the solutions, and the city is providing the kind of the framework to allow people to come up with those creative solutions through things like the urban greening factor and things like that. And they're allowing those trade-offs to happen where you can balance the commercial aspiration of, okay, what happens to building footprint and massing, and what does the public get back as a benefit at ground plane? I think that seems to be working quite well from our perspective at the moment. With the master plan around Broadgate, there were so many things about the original Broadgate that are fabulous, but there were some things that needed to change. And I don't want us to just think about public realm in terms of parks that you can sit in to read a book at lunchtime. It's also about wayfinding, navigation, the pleasure on the commute and those sorts of things. So we've worked quite hard to adapt some of the original characteristics of Broadgate to make them slightly more welcoming. Those sort of subtle physical realm hints to inclusivity and welcomeness, where you can drive change. We've done that. You referenced Italy, which is where we kind of interface with the amenity piece. But that frontage to Bishopsgate, we've got a really, really long frontage that used to have, these rather postmodern balustrades and funny access points and all that sort of thing. A lot of challenge there around levels and traffic, but it's solving those in a different way, to open them up, to add greenery where you can, to add signage and activation so that people as they walk down the street read something that's pleasurable. And then when you've created that physical space, it's trying to unlock those things with occupiers that help activate them, that activated ground plane. Because you've talked about the skyline. I think Damien talked about the skyline before he dropped off, and there's the skyline for the benefit of wider London, and then there's this streetscape for the people who are experiencing it locally. So the city were really, really helpful and creative at the time that we were doing the deal with Italy, to find a way to make the use classes work for quite an interesting and different type of offer, to make it happen. So we've been very fortunate with the attraction of Italy. We've taken a bit of a risk. They've taken a bit of a risk. So far, it seems to have been hugely well received, which we're really, really pleased about. And I hope that as occupiers start to come back to the office, it's part of that amenity that means that the journey to work is for something. It helps with productivity, it helps with health and well-being, and it helps kind of enrich that business environment, whether it's for the quick coffee meeting and all that sort of thing. So hopefully we can see both the public realm and then the levels of amenity that we can provide help drive that productivity and help businesses make money.
Fantastic. I will just remind everyone who's watching today that we are doing a Q&A at the end of this panel in about 10-15 minutes. So if you do have any other questions that you'd like to ask either under your own name or anonymously, please do submit them. Otherwise, we'll continue with the ones that we're really excited to ask each other. And on that, I'd love to speak to Patrick a bit more about, obviously, your projects. And it's been some exciting announcements in the last few weeks, some exciting milestones reached, and it'd be great to hear from you on where you're at with those schemes. And also, taking a step back, obviously, at a wider level, there's certainly been a lot of uncertainty, volatility in the market in the last 12 months. Alistair, you touched on the fact that, probably this time last year, we all thought it might end different to where we are now, but here we are. And despite that, it seems that, the capital markets have performed relatively well. There's still a strong level of investor appetite for London. So keen to hear your thoughts on that and sort of, what underpinned your decision to move forward with these quite ambitious schemes during this time.
Sure. Well, thank you. A lot of great comments has been mentioned by my fellow panelists. But in general, right now, I think the world, we're in a new cycle for many places. And I'm actually very confident in all the financial centers of the world. There's London, Hong Kong, Shanghai, New York. Throughout this process, the world has gone through tremendous amount of digitization. And when bad times come, like we just had, a lot of innovation is being created or it's going to be unleashed. I think for the city in particular, my confidence there remains steadfast. We were investing into London after Brexit, much before COVID. And I think London itself the city has a great deal to offer. I mean, the 24/7 vision laid out by the city a few years ago, I thought was fantastic. And it is really an honor to be a part of it. And I think for London itself, the legal system is one of the most unmatched systems of the world. That gets lost because I guess people in London take it for granted, but it's an amazing system. We have a similar system here in Hong Kong. And I think for a financial center with the oldest history, starting from Roman times, no one can claim that. And talent that we talk about follows great jobs. The key is whether the spaces are attracting the right companies to remain, to be in London, or want to come to London to do more business. And I really believe they will. There's abundant talent, in the UK and all parts of Europe and around the world. London is really a city for everyone. And I think going forward, in particular, like things such as fintech, green finance, AI, robotics, all this stuff is going to be going through a higher velocity of growth because of COVID, because of the digitization. It's very hard in some ways to think about growth right now, because right now, a lot of companies not in the high tech space, like life sciences, have a top line problem. So everyone's focused on the, below the line items. How do I cut this? How do I cut that? But when, vaccination rates go up, when companies don't have a top line problem, what's going to happen then? So your space has to be just right. And I think what the city is doing, I think what my fellow developers are doing, are doing exactly that. And for us, for my two projects, 55 and 70, we have spent a tremendous amount of time on them, but then we ring fence them with ESG right from the get-go. After doing our analysis, like the best thing to do for them is to redevelop the space, which we are a fiduciary duty of the equity into the land. And I think when you think about each process with the ESG ethos, but to me, ESG is not just to corporates, it's actually to everyone. It's not just like corporate governance. What about self-governance, right? Environmental side, social side, it's so relevant. And unfortunate for Hong Kong, and I guess in some ways London, we have been through both sides of the standard deviation curve. The 5% that no one cares about when you study. You had Brexit, COVID. Hong Kong, we had our 2019 episode and also COVID. And I think both of these financial centers will be going through a tremendous amount of growth going forward, and we're in brand new cycles. So that's kind of how I'm looking at London and how I'm looking at the world right now.
Fantastic, and so exciting to hear that you've got obviously a very big focus on ESG. It makes sense from every business and sort of people-centric perspective, and look forward to seeing that being realised, because it seems that it's actually quite a unique market opportunity to lead from the front with that agenda as well, in terms of the product that you could deliver, to the square mile and to the wider market. So excited to see that progress. Alistair, how does that translate for you and the wider policy for the recovery task force? Particularly, we know that the ESG framework is a powerful one, but also in terms of attracting and retaining that talent. There's obviously a lot of demographics around who that talent is, particularly in the tech centre. I mean, over 50% is sort of under the age of 30. So that obviously informs our view of how we shape that environment. But interested to hear your thoughts on what the city is doing to hold on to those people and make them stay, and also want to grow and prosper with the wider ecosystem.
Well, I mean, it's so great to hear Gareth and Karen and Patrick speak as they are. I mean, if you kind of put yourself 10 years before now, hearing developers speak about private space, you would just not believe it. It's so empowering. It is so people-centric, as they've said, and it just makes business sense. The idea, I think that, key thing to answer your question about attracting people and keeping that talent in is having space, both public and private, that people want to come to and they feel part of and they feel welcome to and included into, and we as the corporation are determined to shake off any image that we have of the city being an exclusive place where only certain people are invited. I mean, some of the buildings in Broadgate, for example, are so you don't know which bit's public and which bit's private deliberately, and that's the case. When Patrick and I first spoke about his vision in terms of the city cluster, it was so kind of like, let's break the boundaries here. Let's see where people can go to, where people can feel welcome and going to. And Karen talking about the kind of secret spaces and those places where you can kind of go to some seclusion and discovering all of that. So I think that's what will kind of keep people in the city and bring them in. Our kind of task, though, I suppose, as being in the public and private, and where that kind of blurs, is to ensure we're getting the messaging right and to be speaking to people in the right language and things. And part of this is why we were determined with this recovery task force, is to set the conversation going. And really bluntly, I think in the first few months of the pandemic, was its principal aim, and then for it to be showing how we deliver, and then the delivery mechanism thereafter. So I think I've probably answered your question there, I think. Bridget?
I think so. And if I could just come back again, if you don't mind, out of the Recovery Task Force, what do you see as sort of the big opportunities for the people listening here today to help the corporation with, to deliver that? Because like you said, it's not just about one of us here doing it, it's about us all contributing together. So, where do you see the biggest challenges and therefore opportunities for us to collaborate?
I think particularly from a developer perspective, so wearing my planning hat, as all the other speakers have alluded to, it's about the quality of space. So when you look at the ESG policies, from the kind of top-down ESG policies that Patrick was referring to there, but which actually are bottom-up driven now, as we know. No talent wants to come to a place which isn't fulfilling ESG in its true, very honest and genuine sense. So how do we get space? Well, we've got to renew space, basically, and we've got to renew it in a sustainable, inclusive way. And most large corporations have stated that really clearly, and I think increasingly the SMEs within the city and others are demanding it. So we have space coming up, like Patrick's buildings, like 22 Bishopsgate, etc., like the Broadgate stuff, which is really good, but there's a lot of the city which has got to kind of increase internally its offer. So the challenge for us is, and as Damien said, kind of says our survey, how does internal space and things change? So that's where there's going to be opportunity for us, I think, collectively. It means there is kind of forced change, to pick up on what Patrick's saying. I think as soon as people get away from this kind of grandstanding of like cost cutting on the basis that space is seen as an overhead, and actually see it as empowering for their business and see it as an essential part of their offer, because last time I looked, people generally make good business. There isn't any kind of something else out there that makes business. It's people. So making them most efficient through space is a key thing. So we get over this office is dead, we get over this kind of rationalization of space into a demand for excellent quality space, both public and private. So that's where I think the biggest opportunity for us is. And that's why we're so busy as a planning department. That's why we are, I was going to say overwhelmed, we're not, but we are really busy in terms of the number of applications, pre-application things, because everyone's kind of energized by this agenda.
And how exciting. That's, I mean, not to make you busier than you should be, but that's probably the good end to be on the spectrum as a planning team, to be busy, because we're out, you're out talking to the market and using that to inform the policy going forward. Karen, you've been working across the city for many years, particularly given your role at PLP. How have you seen the city change, and how do you think it's really going to manifest in the next 3 to 5 years with the back of some of the, the wider agenda evolutions that Alistair and Patrick have referred to?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the city has, for the last 10 plus years already focused on trying to make public space better, and that has happened incrementally with changing materials and looking for where they can make improvements here and there, closing little streets and adding greenery and so on. And in aggregate, that's made a big difference. And then there are some of the bolder moves I've just mentioned in my previous part. I think that what I'm looking at now with 22 was one example. It's a very big building, and it's the center of the cluster, which is still growing. We're also looking at other buildings that have been just completed or that are on our boards right now. So, for example, we did a small building at Cannon Street for Fidelity's headquarters, where there is a pocket park opposite Wren's in St. Nicholas Cole Abbey, which is intended to be for the workspace, workforce around, rather than for the tourists who are at St. Paul's. And we're just about to complete the hotel on Bishopsgate, which has a new public plaza, which is probably much needed as a sort of buffer spill out zone from Liverpool Street Station. I think what's changing now too, though, is as you say, the spaces inside the building that are becoming more outward facing, and also the desire from the developers to have terraces and winter gardens and roof terraces in the buildings, which will also visually benefit the street. So, it's a combination of wanting to make those spaces better for the workforce while they're in the building, as well as setting back buildings at ground floor, if not tearing down a building and not building one back, at least perhaps setting back underneath and creating a park underneath at a corner to, London's medieval streetwork is very charming, and it protects you from the busier Roman roads that cut through the city, but they don't leave much in the way of foot pavement. So where the city is closing streets, which has been accelerated thanks to COVID, you could say, or where buildings could set back and have trees, because I think urban greening on the buildings is a good thing, but I think trees in the ground are even better. And if they need to be in planters above ground because of the services underneath, I think that's good as well.
Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, there's one thing I want to add. When we think about projects, everyone asks, like, what do you think of the future of the office? What is a successful building? I think two key points, and I think it's really relevant to the world that we're in now. Number one, the future is hybrid. There's no doubt, right? Because of digitization. That is already here. It's here now, today. It's going to be here tomorrow. It's going to be here 5 years from now. So the key is you have to get your space right. But when we when we thought about our buildings and when we're thinking about what we will do now, because when you go through the planning process in the city, it is an extensive, huge, mammoth effort of many professionals in their best disciplines, and to seek the balance in every single part of your building. My fellow friends here will know what I'm talking about. It is tremendous hard work, right? But the key thing is, the way we think is, if one element of our building can help my neighbors, that's a win. So the key is, we are, for example, opening up our ground floor level on both projects. On 55 Grace Church, we will unearth passageways from 400 years ago. So basically, the muscle memory of walking on Grace Church, you can now go through my building, go to Walkie Talkie, and you can go from River, go straight up through ours to 70 Grace Church, and 70 near 55, we can go directly to Leadenhall, and there will be a passageway through 70 Grace Church. And I'm hoping that muscle memories will change, and these kind of passageways will make stakeholders in other buildings be like, hey, this area is cool. The key is start now, start small. We can't solve everything all at once, but to me, the success is really determined years from now. But the key thing is to be working collaboratively together. And I think that is the secret sauce going forward to make sure everyone has the right space, the right area. And for my fellow stakeholders near where we are, we're establishing a new bid, which at ESG obviously is a big focus. We now have like 15, 20 stakeholders, and that is exciting. And hopefully by the collective effort, we will make sure the space on the ground level as well as in the buildings will be right. And I think that's one element where I believe a lot of my fellow developer friends, they now all share. This is a world we're in, which is to me extremely exciting and something that should be pointed out, just from my point of view. Thank you.
Bridget, if you don't mind if I could just build on a couple of things that Patrick said there, because I think it's quite interesting how we're hearing this discussion, and you're going back to your question of how do we do more. And Alistair was setting out that sort of mindset at like the city level around learning, and there's some of the examples they've done where they've been testing things, testing it, see if it fails, see if people get used to it. To Patrick's point around muscle memory, how quickly do people adapt and then just think, oh, that was fine. Why do we resist it to start with? So there's some of the things around mindset there which are quite, really relevant. Patrick talked about self-governance as well, as like, how do we all try harder or nudge each other? And I think that's really interesting for us in our day-to-day work, how we challenge our colleagues, the supply chain, the people that we work for, all that sort of thing, to just do that bit more, especially for those sort of macro trends around, the post-COVID recovery or, the climate emergency. And Patrick's talked about this test as well of how do you foresee those customer wants when there's such a huge amount of time and effort involved in some of these projects over such a long period. There's quite a high risk of being wrong. So you've got to really listen to what those customer needs are to be able to kind of spot the trends and adapt appropriately. And his final point around that neighborhood approach of being more neighborly. Don't be afraid of being neighborly. Something that's good for your neighbor can also be good for you. It's not a zero-sum game whereby giving something away, you might lose it. It should, we should be challenging each other to do more around that. And, we've tried to do that with some of the buildings we've delivered, and some of the, the public realm that we've worked with at Broadgate is exactly some of those things that he's mentioned with that more neighborly approach, not just about the asset that you own or the estate that you own, but trying to think in a more metropolitan way.
Absolutely. They say London's a city of small villages, and it's about creating those small villages and communities, isn't it, across the square mile. And also, to your point, Patrick, linking up with the wider bid agenda of an umbrella and the different boroughs and boundary lines that might sort of traverse that on different sides. Gareth,
Bridget, I think that's really challenging now, how you get, you can move quickly on a small piece, or, the more things that you add, by nature, you'll move more slowly because it gets more complex to move all the pieces at the same speed. So how do you strike that balance between, the super macro scale and then the individual building scale to make sure that you're making enough progress on all the different fronts around, sustainability and all those other things? And that's a really tricky balance to strike as to what forums and means do you have to make that progress, whether it's through the CPA or through, the Recovery Task Force and all those sorts of things. It's a really hard balance to strike.
Absolutely. Alistair, I mean, from your perspective, that's part of your remit, obviously, trying to balance out those trade-offs, as you mentioned before, and some of the commercial realities of the pace of change from different levels of organisations and business communities. Any sort of thoughts on that?
As I said before, I think most enlightened business is aligned, where we have a public and private. I've always thought in local government, work out where, on the Venn diagram, where the middle is, and aim for that. And we've got a great target at the moment, I think, for this pandemic, and we're fully aligned with our objectives being the same as others, and particularly on this use of space and the attractiveness of space. I mean, another thing I'd highlight is the amount of public space there is in these buildings that, again, would not have, is a new phenomena. It's very, very welcome phenomena of making buildings accessible. If you think about the buildings of the 80s and 90s, they were not accessible. Now they are accessible and inclusive, and in giving views to people, views to Londoners. It's like living in a kind of national park where you can climb up the top of the mountain or hill and see from that level. That's what we've enabled Londoners and visitors to London to do. So I think there's a great alignment and coalescing and collaboration, has been said, between different public and private sector at the moment.
And do you see that accessibility sort of moving the dial, particularly to your point, Patrick, around the hybrid model, people coming and going now at different times? It might not just be from 8 to 6 or 9 to 5, but actually, using this change to open up more of a nighttime economy and more of a weekend economy, getting families in for cultural mile. Is that part of the policy as well? And I think that,
There's one thing though, no one really talked about it because I guess there's been some unfortunate delays, is the Crossrail. That is a game changer, right? 3 hours travel time to 1 or 45 minutes. And that Crossrail, when and if it comes, hopefully soon, will be hybrid's best friend. So you may have someone, maybe before pre-COVID, it's okay to work at home half a day a week. Post-COVID, maybe okay to work from home 2-3 days a week. But then in different shifts, there are all sorts of things you can do. And basically your space will adapt to that. But there's one thing that I do believe that people are really looking to have back. Jamie Dimon has said it of JP Morgan, you need the combustion. I think our meeting right now is much better if we're live in one room versus on a screen. The world is desperately lacking human combustion. We need to find usually balance is seek when you're face to face, your body language. And also, we can't forget lovely office politics. Imagine office life with no politics. That's not real office. So all these things will naturally draw people back into reality. But this is all the good stuff on the come. That's why I feel like a lot of cities, Hong Kong, London, we are in brand new cycles, and the beginning of cycles is always bad. So, but we've got to get a space right.
But also perhaps the most opportunistic as well, because then you can go in and shape what the recovery looks like, which is obviously part of our conversation today. We were involved in that survey that you mentioned, Alistair, where over 4,000 people responded, and within that, identifying what's going to bring them back to the city. Well, that's sort of one of the key questions here. How can we bring people back in the masses at a sustainable level? And it was really interesting to read the results that a big part of it, not surprising, is the people. People want to be around people. They want the buzz, the energy, the office gossip, as you mentioned, Patrick. There's always a bit of gossip. So that piece is always quite interesting as well. So one of my final questions for you is, how do you see the priorities of the Recovery Task Force, and it was put in the Q&A before, aligning with the wider strategic goals of the city, particularly the sort of current planning policy and agenda for the wider built environment planning and development arm?
Yeah, and thanks to Kieran, Callum, for that question. Yeah, I think I kind of pick on two things, but first an overall comment that the direction of travel we were going in before, I think in terms of the city plan, transport strategy and things, were pretty well aligned to how I think we're going now. It's kind of nuances and some finessing, but I'd highlight probably two key parts of it. The first is that in terms of this whole life carbon, I was talking before about the fact that a lot of stock needs to be renewed, but we now have an unacceptability of a default of something needs to be dropped and then rebuilt. So, that may well be the solution sometimes, but that will be properly analysed, I think, from an ESG perspective, and that aligns with our climate action strategy. The second point I make it's about this people focus, is our planning policies are getting more scientific about the experience of the human within the cityscape. So, the reality is we don't want windswept, cold, or too hot, or whatever, or too light or too dark areas. So therefore, we are getting very scientific now about what that means, and that links nicely to Patrick's point about being neighbourly and collaborative, because we are looking to be, it is obvious that from an investment, from an occupier and other perspective, you can't just look at the red line around the building. I mean, that is so 1980s, it's untrue. We've got to kind of look to the whole district, the whole area, and therefore those who are being responsible are looking broader than just their own red line in terms of developments. And that means making a difference on the ecosystem and how people experience their building and the district itself.
Yeah, fantastic. Karen, I'll go to you quickly, because I wanted to pick up on a few points, particularly around the bids, because I know you've been involved in the evolution of some of those across the square mile. How do you see that relationship evolving, particularly to Gareth's point around lining up the agendas and the timelines between,
Can you hear me all right? I've got...
No, I think it's Bridget that's...
Okay. I'm involved in the Aldgate bid. I'm in the board of that, and that's unique among the 4 different city bids, which straddles or is part of Tower Hamlets as well as the city, which is really great because we're working together with an equal number of people representing the different businesses in both Whitechapel and Tower Hamlets, as well as in the city. And Gwyn Richards talks about wanting to make the old Roman city wall a porous element rather than a barrier. And so the planning policy for the sites that I'm looking at, which are on that boundary, is all about how to make the uses in the building interesting for both the city workers and the people in Whitechapel, and also how to improve the pedestrian connectivity, because people in the city want to go to Middlesex Street, for example, or they want to go to Spitalfields to the market, and the city wants people from those residential areas to come into the city potentially for work training or startup spaces. So that's been a very good experience for me to see how the city can take advantage of its fringe areas. The square mile is not very big. The boundary is not moving. It moved for Broadgate, Gareth, but it won't move again probably. So it's really important. First of all, you can walk from the center of the city to the edge in 10 minutes. So it's it's important that if we speak about what's good for our neighbors is good for us, our neighbors include those areas at the edges of the city and how to make those exciting spaces better connected into the city.
Fantastic, thank you, Karen. Sorry, I dropped off there. The glamours of working from home,
yes,
with dodgy Wi-Fi. I'm sure we can all relate. We've only got a few minutes left, so I wanted just to ask everyone a quick fire question. If you've got about 30 seconds to respond, each of you, but really around, taking into consideration everything we've discussed today, the wider initiatives and plans from the corporation, the review of the findings, and also just looking outside, despite the grey weather, the hope for the future, because London has bounced back before, and I'm sure through the efforts of everyone here today and those watching, it will again and again and again. So sort of my last question to everyone, and Patrick, I might start with you, looking for almost the outside in terms of your screensaver.
Yeah.
What do you see as the greatest opportunity to support and sustain the recovery, going forward post where we are right now?
Be in London?
Yes.
Actually, I think the most important thing for everywhere in the world is to have a positive mindset. Because the press, they focus every day, they may, if you read a lot of stuff, it's negative, and people seem to dwell on that. I would say a few things. Number one, be positive. Number two, focus on today. Make sure today you are making the best decision today, and stop worrying about tomorrow. Worry about today. Figure things out, block and tackle, make the best decisions, have a ring fence your philosophies, ring fence what you're good at, what you're not good at. And also the third thing is face reality. It is what it is. It's not going to go back to pre-COVID. It is what it is. A lot of people keep thinking about, before. I think to me, that's a complete waste of time. And time is not on our side. So these are three things I would think are the most important going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Karen, over to you.
I'm actually really excited about what's happening right now. I think I've worked on workspace for most of my professional career, and I think what I'm seeing happening right now is, as others on the panel have said already, that the interests are aligned. The planning policy is aligned. What workers want is aligned, and the companies realize that that's aligned. It is about ESG, to make it shorthand, but it's about making better spaces, better quality, which support creative, talented work, because now, as an architect, I have to admit bankers have creative work today as well. So as an architect, to be able to be given that opportunity to re-look at what is the building, what is the office building, is actually a really refreshing and exciting point in my career, and I think in everyone's career. It's like, how can we make buildings better for the future? How can we make buildings that are not for a 25-year cycle, but are for a 100 or 200-year cycle? So I feel really invigorated by that.
Fantastic, thank you. And Gareth?
Well, picking up on the people's kind of like multiple points approach. So I think there's those macro trends around sustainability and other things where, you've got to be best in class and recognize those things. We work really hard to listen to occupiers and understand their wants and their needs. We've got this great framework that the city has provided that we need to recognise, we need to challenge and drive. And then it comes back to us as British Land and at Broadgate. How can we keep creating the best product in the market, striving to learn and improve with each step that we make, each of the multitude of projects that we've had on over the last 5 years and we will have over the next 5 to 10 years. So let's take that kind of those things together as a recipe to help keep creating the best product in a vibrant city that helps occupiers be productive and do their best work.
Fantastic. Alistair, over to you. Final comments and ideas for the future.
I think a lot of this is about leadership at all levels, and picking up what Patrick said about positivity. I think we need to be very clear about our vision and where we are going to, and enunciate that and make it clear, but equally be listening and not being afraid to get things wrong, to trial things out, just see how things work. As Patrick says again, concentrate today and things kind of work themselves out. And yeah, I think that clarity of vision, and also the fact this is going to take effort. It actually, I don't want, the corporation doesn't want, none of us want to default to what we had before. We need to make things better, and we've got an opportunity to, and everything's aligning for that to happen. So I think we should put the effort in and make it happen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I look forward to, I mean, imagine if we had this conversation in 12 months, hopefully we've come off the back of this and the policy and the recovery focus, and we've got some great lessons learned along the way. So I just thought I'd recap some of the key themes because I'm conscious of time. It seems that really it comes, I mean, there's a lot of complicated parts of this, but really it comes down to, you know, the power of positivity. Patrick, I love that. I love that. And I think it's a big ethos we can all take from. The need for adaptability, both individually and across our organizations, resilience, and also just to keep learning from each other and other countries and cities. And with that, you know, a focus and a belief around the power of engagement and the value of collaboration from all of us involved. So that's enough from me, I'm sure. And thank you so much for everyone joining and for everyone watching today.